Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a truly wild inventory, I have to say, looking at the sources you've shared.
Quite a spread, isn't it?
Yeah, we're going from like the tiniest flicker of light inside a living cell all the way up through, 5,000 years of, ancient trash.
Ancient trash and historical uncertainty.
Right, and then plunging into the deep ocean to find an octopus that apparently built itself a boat. It sounds kind of nuts.
It does, but the scales, huge, the intellectual challenge underneath is surprisingly similar across all of them.
How so?
Well, I think this is really a deep dive into foundations. That's the theme.
Foundations, okay.
Yeah, whether we're talking about building, say, a solid financial strategy, the sources sometimes touch on those parallels of needing informed action or building scientific understanding.
Right.
Knowledge, just like wealth maybe, requires discipline, informed action.
Yeah.
But the biggest enemy, always when you're building that foundation, it's incompleteness. Things are missing.
That's a perfect setup, because we've got these super technical sources on molecular science, right? And philosophical critiques of how history even works.
Yeah.
And then these new biological insights from the ocean. And in every single one, the core mission seems to be overcoming some kind of deficit. Like you said, incompleteness.
Exactly.
The missing light, or the historical reality that's just gone, or the unseen behavior of some deep sea creature.
And we're using tools of, let's say, extreme sensitivity to try and fill those gaps.
Illuminating reality where reality itself is scattering the signal, maybe. Or where time just destroyed the evidence.
Or where the environment, like the deep sea, makes just seeing things nearly impossible.
Okay, so let's start by shining that light, or maybe dealing with the lack of it, in the world of preclinical research. All right, segment 1. Bioluminescence tomography, or BLT. Sounds very high-tech.
It is.
But it's a critical tool, apparently, for things like cancer research, specifically preclinical oncology research. So maybe start us off. What exactly is bioluminescence imaging, BLI, doing for scientists?
Okay, so BLI basically is like putting a tiny surveillance system inside living animals, usually mouse models, right?
Right.
It lets researchers track non-invasively things happening at the molecular level. Like, is a gene turned on or off? Are two proteins interacting? And crucially for cancer, is a tumor growing? Is it spreading?
So it gives them this real-time molecular light show?
Pretty much, yeah. A light show that helps them figure out if therapies are working, assess outcomes, that kind of thing.
And this light show, it relies on reprogramming tiny biological engineers to glow. Is that fair?
That's a good way to put it. The foundation, the mechanism, is usually the luciferase gene.
Ah, the firefly gene.
The classic, yeah. Often engineered into mammalian cells for these studies. It comes from the North American firefly, Photinus pyralis. So you give the animal the right substrate. D-luciferin is the common one. And the chemical reaction happens, and it emits photons. It glows.
But it's not just the firefly system anymore, right? The sources mentioned the options are expanding fast?
Oh yeah, the field's adding variety all the time.
Yeah.
This lets researchers pick light systems based on what they need, maybe different colors, different wavelengths of light, or a signal that lasts longer.
Like what?
Well, you see combinations like ranello-luciferase with choleentrazine or nanoluc with furamazine. They're basically creating these designer light sources to get the best possible view of whatever molecular event they're tracking.
Okay, but the key thing, I guess, is that even the best system, the light it produces, is incredibly faint once it has to travel through tissue.
Extremely faint. That's the challenge. To actually detect it and make an image, you need a really high-end, super specialized camera, usually a cooled charge-coupled device, a CCD digital camera.
Cooled? Why cooled?
Well, the cooling is vital. It minimizes all the background noise, the thermal noise, so that the really subtle signal coming from deep inside the animal can actually be picked up clearly.
Okay, so if they can already see some light with this planar BLI, this sort of 2D approach, why bother with the huge extra complexity of tomography, the BLT? What's wrong with the simple 2D image?
The planar image misses depth and, crucially, accurate quantification.
Meaning?
Well, imagine you've got a tumor deep inside the mouse versus one right under the skin.
Okay.
As that tumor gets deeper, the light it produces has to travel through way more tissue. Right?
Here.
And that tissue scatters the light, it absorbs the photons.
So less light actually escapes to the camera? The 2D image would show a weaker signal, even if the tumor inside is actually bigger or more active.
Exactly. That's the key distinction. Deep tumors, or even just large ones, can look deceptively smaller, or less active in a 2D image because of that tissue self-absorption. It messes up your ability to quantify properly.
So the 2D image can be a bit of a visual lie about what's really going on.
It can be, yeah. It degrades the quantifying power. So bioluminescence tomography, BLT, tries to solve this. It gives you a volumetric, a 3D reconstruction, which is much better for precisely locating the source and getting a true quantification of its activity. But, and this is a big but, the sources are clear that the added complexity and, maybe more importantly, the time it takes to acquire all the data that's deterred widespread use. It's not as routine as the simpler 2D method.
Right. It takes longer. And to speed up that acquisition time, I gather they need even more complex hardware.
They do. See, with a single camera system, you have to rotate the mouse or the camera around the mouse multiple times to get images from all the different angles needed for that 3D map.
Which takes time.
Exactly. So to speed things up, you can use a rotating multi-camera system. It captures all the angles you need pretty much simultaneously.
But that sounds expensive.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
Naturally, that kind of specialized setup bumps up the cost considerably.
Okay, let's get into the guts of the BLT solution then. The algorithm itself. We're fighting darkness, scattered light through tissue. The reconstruction must be a massive computational challenge. What's the algorithm actually doing to rebuild that 3D light source?
All right, so this specific approach to the source details, it's designed for locating small sources within what they call a multi-scattering medium.
Which is just living tissue, basically.
Exactly. Living tissue that's constantly messing with a light path. It's essentially a 3-step computational process to try and reverse engineer where that light came from, despite all the scattering.
Okay, walk us through the 3 steps. How do they start mapping the shape?
Step 1 is geometry and back projection. So the system takes the actual data, the images the camera's collected, and it mathematically projects that light path backwards into the volume into tiny 3D units called voxels.
Okay.
And doing this simultaneously figures out the precise geometry of the boundary of that turbid medium, basically. It maps the shape of the animal and gets a rough idea of where the light source is inside it.
Got it. So that gives them the container, the animal shape, and a first guess for the light's location. But as you said, light doesn't travel straight inside tissue.
Right, it scatters all over.
Yeah.
Which brings us to step 2. And this involves a really key moment of, well, approximation. They determine an initial order approximation for something called the photon fluence.
Photon fluence.
Yeah, think of it as the flow or the density of photons moving through the tissue. They calculate this first estimate using physics, the diffusion equation, the path length, and they plug in variables like how strong the light source is estimated to be and the known optical properties of the tissue itself, how much it absorbs, how much it scatters light.
Okay, wait. This sounds like where that theme you mentioned earlier, the sort of subjective input starts creeping in, even in the super technical math. They have to put in an initial guess, based on physics, sure, but still a guess to start the refinement.
That is absolutely the critical component here. This initial approximation, this educated guess, it's vital because living tissue is such a noisy, difficult environment. The algorithm needs a robust, informed starting point to build on.
Otherwise, it might just get lost computationally.
Pretty much. This initial guess helps prevent the next iterative steps from just wandering off track into nonsense solutions. It anchors the process.
Okay, so step 3 must be the refinement. Taking that initial guess and honing it, making it accurate.
Exactly. Step 3 is the iterative deblurring. They use a statistical method called expectation maximization, or EM.
Okay.
Think of it like this. The computer takes its current best guess of the 3D image, compares it to the actual raw data the camera's collected, calculates the error or the difference, and then it repeatedly adjusts the image using something like a Gaussian deblurring kernel, refining it bit by bit, iteration by iteration, until the image stops changing much and the light source is localized as accurately as possible.
Wow, that sounds like an immense amount of calculation just to pinpoint a light source in 3D space. How long does this computational workout actually take?
Oh, remarkably, the source says this whole intensive procedure, from that initial guess through all the iterative deblurring, takes maybe 15 to 20 minutes on a standard desktop Linux workstation.
That's actually pretty manageable.
It is. The speed of modern computers is really what makes this kind of extreme imaging practical for research labs.
Okay, but none of this works, algorithm or not, without the right hardware up front. The detection gear. We established it needs extreme low light performance. So let's dig into the tech foundation that makes sure every photon counts.
Right. Sensitivity is everything. You maximize it, by controlling physical factors and minimizing noise. First, you optimize the hardware itself for light capture. You adjust the field of view, the lens aperture, the f-stop, and really importantly, you use something called pixel binning.
Pixel binning.
Yeah.
That sounds like a trade-off. You mentioned resolution versus sensitivity.
It absolutely is. You sacrifice some spatial resolution, some sharpness in the image to boost the signal. The camera electronically combines the signal from a block of adjacent pixels, say 2x2 or 4x4, even 8x8 pixels, and reads them out as one big superpixel.
Ah, I see.
This captures way more photons over a larger area, dramatically improving sensitivity, but yeah, it does blur the fine details a bit.
Makes sense. And what about just the basic efficiency of the detector? Like how many photons that actually hit the sensor chip produce a detectable signal?
That's its quantum efficiency, or QE. It's the percentage of incoming photons that get detected. For bioluminescence, you need sensors that are really good in the specific light spectrum produced, and ideally, you want a QE approaching 100%.
Which is impossible, but...
Right, but modern sensors get remarkably close. Things like back-illuminated or BSI, CMOS sensors can boast peak QEs as high as 92%. They really are incredibly efficient photon vacuums these days.
But even the best vacuum cleaner has to deal with interference, right? You mentioned cooling earlier, thermal noise.
Absolutely critical. Cooling is essential to minimize what's called dark current. That's electrons being generated just by heat, not by light hitting the sensor. It creates background noise.
So you cool it down, way down.
Conventional CCDs often need deep cooling, sometimes down to -90 or even -100 degrees Celsius, because for every 7 or 8 degrees you drop the temperature, you basically cut the thermal noise in half. Though newer camera designs are getting clever. They use sophisticated components and electronics to achieve ultra-low dark current, similar to those deep-cooled CCDs, but without needing quite such extreme external cooling systems.
Okay, one last noise source, read noise. The noise generated just by reading the signal off the chip.
That's kind of the final frontier in noise reduction. Traditional CCDs have noticeable read noise. To beat this, advanced sensors were developed, like EMCCDs, electron multiplying CCDs, which actually amplify the tiny signal before the noisy readout stage.
Okay.
But even standard designs now are getting smarter. They're incorporating on-camera intelligence features, software, really that can actively correct for defective pixels on the sensor and algorithmically subtract the dark current that's built up during the exposure, all to make sure the final quantitative data is as clean and accurate as possible.
All right, we've seen how extreme tech, sensitive cameras, and clever algorithms, plus a bit of educated approximation, help overcome physical incompleteness, the scattered light. Now we're shifting gears completely, right? To historical incompleteness.
Yeah, a big shift.
We're moving from fighting scattered photons in tissue to fighting, well, the ravages of time itself.
It's a really powerful transition, I think, because archaeology bumps up against this profound philosophical limit. Unlike, say, physics or chemistry, where you can test your models against reality again and again.
Right, repeatable experiments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In archaeology, the historical reality you're studying, it just doesn't exist anymore. Time has completely destroyed it.
So the passage of time creates this, what the source called an unbridgeable gap. Even the best preserved sites, like Pompeii or something, they're still inherently incomplete records.
Fundamentally incomplete.
So if that past reality, the actual historical situation, is forever lost, how does that affect archaeology's claim to be scientific?
Well, it means that when an archaeologist builds a model and explanation for an ancient setting, and the data they find seems to confirm it, that confirmation only proves a correlative match. It fits the evidence we have in the archaeological record.
But it doesn't prove the model actually matches the real historical situation that existed back then.
Precisely. Because that reality is gone, you can often come up with several different competing models. And all of them might correspond perfectly well to the same limited set of surviving data.
If multiple models can fit the same data, does that push archaeology closer to, I don't know, historical interpretation or storytelling rather than being a hard science?
It definitely forces us to recognize that the work is inherently interpretative. Or, as the source puts it, hermeneutical, which brings up this huge issue, relying only on the physical stuff, the artifacts, versus relying on written sources, on texts, when they exist.
And the sources seem really clear that texts can sometimes be astonishingly revealing about things that the material culture, the pots and stones, completely misses.
Oh, absolutely. It can be incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, to spot something like, say, the presence of a foreign community just by digging up their stuff.
Why is that?
Because they might just adopt local ways. use local pottery, build houses in the local style. Materially, archaeologically, they might just blend in and become invisible.
Is there a classic example of that kind of material invisibility?
The old Assyrian colonies in Anatolia, in modern Turkey, that's the textbook case.
Okay.
If we hadn't discovered the thousands of cuneiform tablets detailing their trade networks, their contracts, their whole existence, archaeologically, these colonies would have been virtually invisible.
Wow.
Because the Assyrian colonists completely adopted the local Anatolian architecture styles and pottery types. Looking at the digs alone, you wouldn't necessarily know they weren't locals. Their distinct social and economic life, their foreign identity, was hidden in the material record. It was the written text that blew it wide open.
So without the text, a massive historical reality would have just been missed.
Yeah, entirely lost, yeah, based on material culture alone. That really highlights why the field, at least for periods where writing exists, has to be defined as an empiric hermeneutical discipline.
Empiric hermeneutical, meaning?
Meaning it relies on empirical evidence, the stuff you dig up, but it also has to rely on interpretation, on cultural understanding, often derived from text, the hermeneutic side, to bridge the gaps the artifacts leave behind. You know, the discovery of the Ugarit tablets did something similar for understanding late Bronze Age Canaanite culture stuff you just couldn't get from the Canaanite material remains alone.
Okay, but here's the catch, right? Those textual disciplines, studying ancient texts, they face the exact same fundamental problem. The actual history of the texts themselves is also lost to time.
Absolutely. It's the same incompleteness problem, just one step removed. The real textual history, how ancient texts like, say, the Bible, were actually compiled, edited, copied, changed over centuries. That process is forever lost.
So you can make models about how a text came together?
Right? Scholars propose models. But no amount of hypothesis testing can ever empirically verify those models against the actual lost historical process of the text creation, which leads, again, to competing perspectives, different scholarly camps, none of which can be definitively proven right based on hitting some lost reality.
So historically, how did scholars try to deal with this uncertainty, especially when judging if events described in texts actually happened? The source mentioned a critical approach.
Yeah, for a long time, many scholars adopted this sort of critical approach, basically using a rationality criterion. They judge whether a reported ancient event was likely to have happened based on whether it seems rational from a modern perspective.
Which sounds problematic.
Deeply flawed, yeah, because it assumes human behavior, past or present, is always rational, which, I mean, history constantly shows is not the case. People do unlikely, seemingly irrational things all the time. You just can't determine historicity based on whether something sounds reasonable to us today.
But sometimes the archaeological record itself pushes back against that scholarly skepticism, right? The sources gave some great examples of textual details that were once widely dismissed by scholars, only to be later confirmed by some rare, concrete find.
Yes. Two examples really stand out as these powerful corrective moments. First, there was this great rebellion against an ancient Akkadian king, Naram-Sin.
Okay.
Its historicity was doubted by many scholars, until, amazingly, a fragment of a student's school practice text from that very period was found. And it confirmed that, yes, literary works were being composed about this rebellion while it was contemporary history. It completely flipped the scholarly consensus.
Wow, okay. And the second one?
Maybe even more famous, the historicity of the biblical King David.
Right, a huge debate.
Huge debate. Many prominent academics dismissed him as legendary, a later invention, until the discovery in the 1990s of the Tel Dan stele, an inscription from the 9th century BC, which clearly contains the phrase House of David.
Concrete proof.
Concrete, contemporary evidence referring to his dynasty. It didn't silence all debate, of course, but it was a massive archaeological confirmation of a figure previously doubted based on lack of evidence.
So these rare discoveries really underscore the point. The absence of physical evidence isn't proof an event didn't happen. It's just proof that the record is incomplete.
Exactly. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as they say. And, you know, even when archaeology uses its greatest strength, its unique ability to date structures using organic material, like radiocarbon dating, it's still dependent on other specialized disciplines, like dendrochronology, tree ring dating.
Okay.
And even those supposedly precise methods run into this fundamental challenge of interpretation and approximation.
What are the specific issues with relying on tree ring dating, according to the source?
Well, dendrochronology, it turns out, requires a crucial element of subjective judgment. The source actually quotes a dendrochronologist, pointing out that the practiced dendrochronologist is looking for matches that he or she is willing to accept based on experience as correct matches between long ring patterns.
Willing to accept based on experience. So it's not purely objective pattern matching.
Apparently not entirely. That professional experience, that learned subjective judgment, is needed to bridge the uncertainties in the wood samples themselves to decide what counts as a reliable match.
And the practical reality, the actual results, can show just how wide that uncertainty can be, even with these supposedly absolute dating techniques.
Oh yeah. Look at the example given from Tel Brak in Syria. They took grain and charcoal samples from the exact same destruction layer, the one right before King Naram Sin built his palace there.
Okay, same layer. Should be the same date.
You'd think. But the radiocarbon dates came back as 2023 BC for one sample and 2662 BC for another.
Wait, that's over 600 years apart from the same layer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A massive difference. So what do archaeologists do? They have to use their judgment, their knowledge of the historical context, pottery styles, everything else, to assign a reasonable historical date somewhere between those two conflicting empirical measurements. The hard date isn't always so hard.
Okay, so we've established that some human approximation, some judgment call seems necessary, whether you're calculating photon flow in BLT or assigning an archaeological date. Let's take that philosophical angle now and get really practical, really micro scale, digging into middens, ancient garbage dumps.
Right, reading the rubbish.
To try and extract the fine texture of past daily life.
Middies are fascinating. They're just everywhere in the archaeological record, especially in prehistoric coastal or maritime cultures. They can range from little pits to absolutely enormous mounds, maybe 20 meters tall in some places.
Potholes of old trash.
Well, that was the old view. For the longest time, especially back in the 19th century, archaeologists mostly saw them as just food refuse. You know, the leftovers from big feasts, clam bakes, that kind of thing.
But the modern view is more nuanced, isn't it? They're seen more as cultural landscapes now.
Much more. Archaeologists today definitely use them to understand past environments, what people were eating, resource use. But increasingly, they're looking at certain types of deposits, especially things like shell rings, as having social, ceremonial, or even ideological functions.
So not just garbage dumps.
No. That old simple split like sacred burial mounds over here, secular garbage middens over there, that's now seen as way too simplistic, especially when you look at the woodland period shell ring middens found along the Florida Gulf Coast.
Okay, tell me about these shell rings. They were roughly circular.
Yeah, roughly circular deposits, usually made mainly of shell, often surrounding a central empty space, a plaza, and sometimes they're right next to burial mounds.
And the sources point to a really interesting change over time in Florida linked to social shifts. Around 650, 700 AD.
Yeah, a fascinating chronological change. It marks the shift from what are called Swift Creek sites, that's middle woodland period, to Weeden Island sites, which is late woodland.
Okay, Swift Creek to Weeden Island. How did the middens change?
Well, the earlier Swift Creek middens tended to be smaller rings, and the shell refuse itself was more heavily concentrated and pretty evenly distributed all the way around the ring's circumference.
Okay, evenly spread. And the later Weeden Island sites.
The Weeden Island rings were often significantly larger in diameter, which implies they needed a bigger central plaza space. But, and here's the key difference, the shell wasn't deposited evenly anymore. It was often dumped only in certain spots, usually just on one side of the ring.
Huh. So the full circle shape might only be visible if you track, say, pottery fragments all the way around.
Exactly. The shell is concentrated, but the ceramics show the full ring outline.
So they deliberately made the site bigger, needed more plaza space, but weren't treating the refuse dumping the same way. What does that subtle but apparent...
Well, ceramics appear, which are linked to new mortuary practices. So the thinking is, this might signal the arrival or development of a new mortuary cult.
Oh.
The community needed a larger footprint, maybe for bigger gatherings in that central plaza. And there's even some evidence suggesting the placement of the new burial mounds associated with these larger rings was carefully aligned, maybe solar-oriented.
Interesting.
And this pattern, this rapid change, sometimes the new, bigger Weeden Island site is just dozens of meters away from the older Swift Creek one.
Yeah.
It only really becomes clear when you look at multiple sites together as a whole cultural landscape. It suggests evolving ceremonial needs, changing social organization, reflected right there in the trash heaps and site layout.
That's fascinating. Now, let's zoom in even further to the microscopic world. We're going to Tadahayuk, that massive Neolithic village site in Turkey. Why is this microstratigraphic approach so crucial there, especially when looking at their middens?
It's essential at Çatalhöyük, precisely because the houses themselves were kept apparently remarkably clean.
Really?
Yeah.
Neolithic neat freaks.
Seems like it. There's very little evidence of everyday activities happening inside the buildings themselves. It looks like the population was constantly sweeping up debris, food waste, ash, everything, and dumping it outside into these midden areas between the houses. So the trash heaps hold all the secrets of daily life.
Pretty much. And the microstratigraphic approach, which integrates looking at soil-thin sections under a microscope, micromorphology, with geochemical analysis and phytolith analysis, these tiny plant fossils.
Right.
That whole toolkit lets you analyze incredibly fine layers, sometimes less than a millimeter thick.
Less than a millimeter. What kind of detail can that possibly reveal that normal digging would miss?
It reveals the frequency and the specifics of really routine tasks that you just don't see traces of inside the buildings. Things like frequent floor sweeping or repeatedly cleaning out hearths. You see these as distinct, finely laminated layers of ash and tiny bits of organic material in the middens.
Like a daily or weekly record. Exactly. And you can even potentially spot singular events. The source mentions, for example, finding a highly concentrated layer of wheat husk phytoliths that was less than 2 millimeters thick.
Okay.
Which might represent a single intense episode of crop processing, maybe threshing or winnowing, happening right there in the midden area.
It's like an ultra-high-resolution historical snapshot. And the specific types of things included in these microlayers, the inclusions, they revealed the function of the trash, right?
Absolutely. For instance, coprolites, fossilized feces, and dung fragments. Are they non-burnt? That might just indicate stable cleaning or general waste. But if they're charred, that suggests the dung was being used as fuel.
Makes sense.
Phytoliths, those microscopic plant silica bodies, are super abundant. They mostly indicate wild grasses and reeds were common, often showing up as inclusions within animal dung fragments, confirming the dung fuel idea. But phytoliths also show up as plant material added deliberately as temper in building materials, like mud brick or plaster. But what's really intriguing, perhaps, are these infrequent but repeated distinct layers, showing in situ burning that happened right there in the midden. And these layers contain reddish clay aggregates, little clumps of burnt clay that are not typically found in normal domestic hearth ash.
Reddish burnt clay.
Yep.
What might that imply?
Well, the source notes these aggregates look quite similar to burnt soil particles found in controlled high-heat contexts at later sites, specifically associated with things like bonfire kilns used for firing pottery.
Ah, so they might have been firing pottery right there in the trash heaps?
It's a plausible suggestion. Given the quality of the ceramics they actually find at Çatalhöyük, it's possible these midden areas were sometimes used for specialized craft activities like bonfire kiln firing. An interpretation that depends entirely on being able to spot those tiny, distinct burnt clay layers through microstratigraphy.
Amazing detail. Okay, let's fast forward quite a bit now to historical archaeology. The Van Sweringen site in Maryland, 17th and 18th century colonial America. Here, the middens were often disturbed, mixed up by plowing over the years, yet the researchers could still track cultural changes.
Yeah, that's a really key finding for historical archaeologists who often deal with disturbed sites. They show that even with significant soil mixing from plowing, specific patterns in the artifacts patterns linked to social status, building function, and importantly, change over time, were still resilient, still recognizable in the midden assemblages.
Okay, so what changes did they see over time?
Temporally, the overall density of artifacts found in the middens went up by about a third between Phase 1, which was the late 17th century, and Phase 2, the early 18th century.
Right.
More stuff being thrown away, basically.
Okay, more trash. But the pattern of disposal also changed dramatically, didn't it? And that suggests a shift in the colonial mindset.
It really seems to. The pattern shifted from these broad, fairly homogeneous midden spreads in Phase 1, where trash was mainly dumped just west and south of the main house, to smaller, more distinct, discrete dumping locations in Phase 2, with disposal shifting more to the north and east.
Less widespread, more contained dumping. Why the change?
The researchers suggest two bigger cultural factors might be at play here, reflecting how the colony was evolving.
What are they?
First, just a general trend you see in colonization. Behavior becomes increasingly complex and specialized as the new society develops, matures, gets more established, things get more organized.
Okay, natural maturation.
And the second, and this is highly relevant for the timing, the early 18th century, It's linked to a shift in cultural values associated with the rise of the Georgian order.
Ah, the Georgian aesthetic. Order, symmetry.
Exactly. That whole cultural mindset emphasized greater formality, segmentation of spaces and activities, more order in domestic life. And that apparently extended even to trash disposal. It became less casual, less widespread, more controlled, more segmented. The new societal obsession with order was literally reflected in how they structured their garbage dumps.
That's incredible. And they could even use the trash to figure out the function of specific outbuildings on the site.
Yes, through careful comparison of the artifact assemblages. So they compared the trash associated with the main dwelling house to the trash found near a separate outbuilding.
Yeah.
And they found similar proportions of common stuff like everyday ceramics and bottle glass.
Ah.
The outbuilding's trash had significantly different proportions of tobacco pipes and animal bone, and it contained more imported coarse earthenware pottery types.
Suggesting different activities or status.
Possibly different activities, yeah. And then there was a really specific case, Midden F, which seemed to be associated with a dairy building. That midden showed a noticeably higher proportion of bottle glass fragments compared to others.
Okay. And when they checked the excavation records for the dairy building itself, sure enough, the records noted large numbers of glass sherds found in the fill of the dairy's cellar.
Ah, so the specialized trash dump corroborated the building's specialized function identified through excavation.
Exactly. The trash patterns provided independent confirmation.
Right. We've used micro-precision on trash to reconstruct daily life and algorithms to reconstruct faint light. Now we're heading out, sailing into the deep ocean to talk about the Argonaut octopus.
Yeah, the Argonaut, also called the paper nautilus, truly a bizarre and wonderful creature.
It provides just a stunning example of biological adaptation,
That's
right? Overcoming the challenges of its environment.
Absolutely. First off, let's get the identity straight. Despite the name paper nautilus, it's not a true nautilus. It's actually a free-swimming pelagic octopus, family Argonautidae.
Pelagic meaning open ocean, not seafloor.
Right. And crucially, they evolved from benthic ancestors octopuses that lived on the seafloor, which makes their adaptation to living full-time in the open water column even more remarkable. And then there's that crazy size difference between males and females.
Oh, the sexual dimorphism is extreme. The males are tiny dwarfs, and they don't have a shell at all. The females are much, much larger. They can get up to, 50 centimeters long maybe, and weigh like 600 times more than the male.
600 times, wow. And it's the female who makes that famous shell, that delicate, white, calcified thing, using her arms.
Yeah, she secretes it using these specialized wide, flattened membranes, webbed flanges on her first pair of arms. She basically builds her own house.
So what was the long-held belief about what that shell was for?
Well, historically, going way back, there was speculation, Aristotle, I think, that they used it like a little boat, rowing with their arms, maybe even using the webs as sails.
Seriously, sailing octopuses.
Yeah, kind of romantic, but wrong. For centuries, the more accepted scientific view is that the shell was primarily just a case for her eggs, a place to lay them and brood them safely.
Okay, makes sense. An egg case. But recent observations out in the wild, they revealed a surprising secondary function, one that's essential for her survival.
That's right. This is the really cool part. For any animal living pelagically in the open water, maintaining your vertical position without constantly swimming and burning energy is a huge challenge.
Neutral buoyancy.
Exactly. Argonauts, the animals themselves, are naturally negatively buoyant, meaning if they stop swimming, they sink.
Okay.
But the shell, it turns out, functions as a precisely managed hydrostatic structure. The female uses it to control her buoyancy, to stay level at specific depths.
The shell is a buoyancy device, so the Argonaut literally built itself a life jacket or maybe a submarine ballast tank.
Kind of, yeah, a biological ballast tank. But how does an octopus living in the open ocean get and manage air for buoyancy? That's the amazing part.
Okay, how does she do it?
She performs this really complex multi-step sequence, and she has to do it right at the sea surface, which is a big behavioral commitment, very exposed.
Right. What are the steps?
Okay,
Yeah.
Step 1. At the surface, she carefully rocks the shell back and forth to gulp down a precisely measured volume of air. It has to be the right amount to counteract her body weight later on.
She has to estimate her own weight and the air volume needed on the fly.
Seems like it. Incredible calculation.
Yes.
Step 2. She immediately uses those specialized flanged arms, the ones that build the shell, to seal off that trapped bubble of air inside the shell opening.
Traps the air. Then what?
Then comes the controlled dive. Step 3. She actually changes the direction of her funnel jet, her siphon, and uses really strong jets of water to actively force the shell downwards. The shell is now buoyant because of the trapped air, so she has to fight that buoyancy to descend.
Pushing against the flotation.
Exactly. And as she goes down, she often releases little streams of excess air bubbles to fine-tune the buoyancy and maintain control during the descent.
Okay, so she forces herself down, adjusting the air until
Step 4. She levels out at her target depth. Observations in the wild suggest this is often around 7 or 8 meters down. At that depth, the increasing water pressure has compressed the trapped air bubble just enough.
Boyle's Law.
Right. The compressed air volume provides just the right amount of lift to perfectly cancel out her own negative body weight.
Yeah.
She achieves neutral buoyancy.
And then she can swim easily.
Exactly. She can then swim rapidly and pretty much effortlessly parallel to the surface because she doesn't have to constantly fight sinking or floating. It saves a massive amount of energy.
That is just an amazing behavioral adaptation. But it must have limitations, right? Compared to other cephalopods that manage gas, like the true nautilus?
Oh, big limitations.
Yeah.
The true nautilus, the chambered nautilus, uses rigid internal shell chambers. It can control gas pressure within those chambers very precisely, allowing it to adjust buoyancy over a huge depth range, down to maybe 750 meters.
Wow.
The Argonaut shell, though, it's non-chambered. It's basically one big space. And it's not entirely rigid. It's quite brittle. So the volume of that trapped air bubble is directly affected by the surrounding water pressure.
Meaning it only works well near the surface?
Pretty much. The physics means the effective buoyancy control probably only works over a relatively small vertical range. The source speculates maybe just the upper 10 meters or so of the water column.
Which explains why adult females are often seen right at the surface. They have to keep going back up to grab that air gulp and recharge the system.
Makes perfect sense. And contrast that with the males who have no shell and the very young, immature females, say, with mantle lengths less than 9 millimeters.
They don't have the shell buoyancy system yet.
Right. And significantly, they have been collected in deep nets, sometimes between 50 and 200 meters down, way deeper than the adult females seem to operate with their air tanks.
So the males and young females must use other strategies to stay afloat down there.
Presumably, yeah. Different, currently unknown strategies, unhindered by the need for surface-acquired gas.
This whole Argonaut buoyancy thing, it's just a fantastic case of evolution finding a way, isn't it?
It really is. It's a powerful example of evolutionary convergence with the true nautilus.
Convergence meaning?
Meaning both groups independently evolved similar solutions to the same problem. Both transitioned from a bottom-growing benthic life to an open ocean pelagic life by using an external shell and gas-mediated buoyancy.
But they got there differently.
Very differently. The true nautilus did it with complex internal shell structures. The Argonaut achieved it with far less complex morphology, but compensated with this incredibly precise, complex, multi-step behavioral sequence as its foundation. Nature is clever.
Well, we have reached the end of this particular deep dive into illumination, interpretation, and incompleteness. We've gone from counting individual photons inside a mouse tumor to deciphering ancient societal shifts from micro layers of ash and trash.
Yeah.
And finally, documenting an octopus that literally swallows air to float. It's been quite the journey.
It has. And I think the essential takeaway, the thread connecting all these disparate sources, remains this need for complex, often high-precision methods, whether they're technological, archaeological, or biological, specifically to overcome fundamentally incomplete data.
Right. You need BLT's iterative algorithms and sensitive cameras to reconstruct the location of light that's lost to scattering tissue.
Yeah, and archaeology needs tools like microstratigraphy and that constant comparison between texts and artifacts to try and reconstruct pieces of a historical reality that's largely lost to time.
And the Argonaut, it needs that intricate, precise gas-gulping behavior to compensate for the physical limitations of its non-rigid shell in the ocean environment.
Exactly. All strategies to fill the gaps left by incompleteness.
We rely on these specialized methods, this precision, to push back against the uncertainty that incompleteness creates. But maybe the most interesting and slightly unsettling thread running through all these sources is the inescapable, almost essential role of crucial yet somewhat subjective human steps in the process.
That's a really critical point. Think back to the BLT reconstruction algorithm. That whole complex three-step solution. It requires that initial order approximation for the photon fluence, right? That educated starting guess. It relies heavily on the researcher's understanding of the physics of latent tissue to even get the process started correctly.
It's not purely automated. There's a judgment call baked in.
There is. And then recall the philosophical limits we talked about in archaeology. Even their most technical dating method, dendrochronology, tree ring dating, it ultimately hinges on the subjective judgment of the practiced expert, the dendrochronologist, who has to decide, based on experience, whether they're willing to accept a ring pattern match is correct.
Experience and judgment bridging the gap in the data itself.
Precisely. So this raises, I think, a really powerful question for you, the listener, as you encounter specialized data and expert claims in any field. When these highly technical methods reach their inherent limits, whether those limits are imposed by physics or by the destruction of time or by the difficulty of observing an environment, and they require some subjective approximation, some practiced human expertise, or some learned experience to proceed. How do we evaluate the validity, the reliability of the knowledge claims that follow from that?
That's a tough one. How much are we relying on the expert's trained eye or gut feeling versus purely objective data?
And maybe taking it a step further. If this reliance on expert, practiced human judgment is an unavoidable necessity across so many complex fields, if the objective data alone is often inherently insufficient to provide a complete answer, then how do we effectively manage the uncertainty this introduces? And what new systems or checks might we need to build, not just to trust the expert, but to rigorously verify the reliability of that necessary human foundation upon which so much knowledge is built?
A challenging question indeed, something to definitely ponder.